Good morning. Oops. We're on our last lesson of this quarter. The new books are here. If you didn't notice them, they're on the table in the front, on the door side of the table. Be looking at David and Solomon starting next week. But today, our final character study of this spring quarter will focus on Judas Iscariot, to be specific. One of the interesting things about the list of apostles and all the first three gospel accounts is there are certain patterns in the list. There's some variation, but even with the variation, some have noticed patterns in groupings and things like that. Peter is always first, and Judas Iscariot is always last. In all three lists in the Gospels, Judas is always mentioned last. And there's probably a reason for that. In both Matthew and Mark, he is described as the one who betrayed Jesus. Before it ever happened, obviously. Of course, it had happened by the time they wrote it, but in the narrative at least, before it ever happened, he's already characterized and described as the one who betrayed Jesus. Luke says that he became a traitor, Luke 6:16. And although John doesn't record a list of the 12 apostles, he referred to Judas in a similar way. Like in chapter 6, verses 70 and 71, Jesus said, "Did I not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil?" And then John says he spoke of Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him. So even John, even though he didn't have a list, he still describes Judas as the one who was going to betray Jesus. And really that decision to betray Jesus, we talked about Thomas a couple weeks ago, being remembered and pretty much known as the doubter because of that one moment. Judas's decision to betray Jesus is what defined him. And as soon as you hear the name Judas Iscariot, and maybe even just the name Judas, that may be the first thing you think of, is the traitor, the one who betrayed the Lord. And whenever he is mentioned in Scripture, a reference to his betrayal is never far away, never far behind it. And while it may not be possible, and I would argue probably is absolutely impossible to fully understand what motivated Judas to do that, greed seems to have been a part of it. He loved money, it seems. We're told explicitly that he had a weakness for money. He was in charge of the money box of Jesus' ministry because Jesus put him in charge of that, interestingly. And yet, the apostles apparently later learned that he had been skimming some money out of it. Maybe not the whole time, but for a considerable amount of time, for some amount of time. But if Judas thought that his reward for betraying Jesus would make his life complete or whatever, he was very much mistaken. He didn't receive a large sum of money, but 30 pieces of silver, and maybe that was a considerable amount of money. It wasn't anything worth it, nowhere near worth it. And in fact, it wasn't even money was not going to be able to erase his guilt, but it just led to sorrow, it led to remorse, and sadly, even death. Paul warned Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:10, "The love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." The love of money, unlike the way that verse is quoted usually, or paraphrased, money is the root of all evil. Not even close to what Paul says, but he does say the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And through the love of money, many people have wandered away from the faith, and many people have really done themselves damage, hurt themselves in the long run. Judas is an example of that. He's a perfect illustration of what can happen when a person lets the devil work in his life, gives the devil an opportunity. But as Christians, we got to choose a different path. Paul said, give no place to the devil, no place whatsoever. Do not give him an inch in your life. Don't give him an opportunity. He's going to take it if you give it to him. And we must not allow the riches of the world to distract us from our service to Christ. So, in our lesson here, we're going to start in John 13, the beginning of John 13, and then a little bit near the end of John 13. And then we'll be in Matthew 26, and then we'll be in Matthew 27 to look at these three more or less snapshots of Judas's legacy, if you will. So, John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, says, Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. A couple things to point out here. The devil had apparently already put it into the heart of Judas.
But the devil didn't make him do it. You know, it's like a saying, the devil made me do it.
Yeah, the devil made me do it. That's just an excuse. It's no different than saying somebody else made me do it. Maybe a good thing to note here in verse 2, John 13:2, is that it interprets verse 27, or at least helps to understand verse 27, which is a more difficult statement. In verse 27, we'll see in just a second, we'll go ahead and point it out. It says Satan entered into him. And we could get hung up on that and think, what does that mean, that Satan entered into him? Well, I think the key is verse 2. Satan put it into the heart of Judas already before this time, and then it's almost like he opened that door again and made it even more official. He was going to do it. Now, the devil could put something into your heart that you never do. Judas didn't do that. He allowed the devil to put this into his heart, and then he was going to carry through with it. Yeah, Dean?
This reminds me of Pharaoh. It says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. God did not directly, harden his heart. It was just Pharaoh himself. He hardened his own heart.
Yeah.
He let it to be hardened because of the fact that he was the king, so to speak. He was Pharaoh, and he was the top dog. What anybody tell him what to do.
Yep. Very interesting in that Exodus account. 20 different times Pharaoh's heart is said to be hardened. 10 of those times it says God did it. And 10 of the times it says Pharaoh did it. So it was something that sometimes we might be confused about, like why would God do that? Well, it seems that God let Pharaoh do it. He let it happen. If nothing else, that we could say about the expression of, somebody making his heart hard 10 times, Pharaoh himself is said to have done it. So God played some kind of role, but at the end of the day, Pharaoh was responsible, and God told him directly, or at least through Aaron and Moses, that I brought you up to this position for this very occasion, because he knew that Pharaoh was going to be the kind of man to do what he was going to do, to refuse. Well, Judas is in a similar situation, at least as being responsible himself, even though the devil played a part. But the devil plays a part in every sin, doesn't he? One way or another, the devil is behind it. Or at least the principles and will, so to speak, of the devil is a part of it, because that's whose will we're doing whenever we sin. So, skipping on down to verse 21 then, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit, this is John 13 still, and testified, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered him, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I've dipped it." So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "What you're going to do quickly." Now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. So Jesus, in some way, identifies Judas, obviously not overly clearly, because the very next verse or statement says they didn't know what Jesus was talking about, which is not unusual. But I also have a note here that I should have mentioned with John 13:2, that it also helps Luke 22, verse 3, along with John 13:27, that says Satan entered into Judas. So Luke 22:3 and John 13:27 both say that Satan entered Judas. And John 13:2 just gives us a little bit of more understanding of what exactly that means, or at least a part of what that means. That he had opened his heart, apparently, obviously not intentionally. Judas didn't think he was doing the devil's work. We don't know what he was thinking. We can speculate, but we don't really know exactly what he was thinking. We can put together that he apparently wasn't thinking that Jesus was going to be taken and killed. Ironically, the one who betrayed Jesus and helped deliver him to them apparently was not expecting it to actually work, and that may help us to understand exactly why he did do what he did, but we can't be certain in any case. What we do know from this first part is Judas gave an opportunity to the devil, and the devil took it, because he's pretty good at that. Even when Jesus said, it seems, again, even though John, who is presumably the one that asked Jesus, "Who is it?" So we have Peter, who was sitting over there on the other side of the table. John was sitting right there next to Jesus, where Jesus, the way they would recline at the table, Jesus would be in front of John, and he, leaned up and said, "Who is it?" And he told him. So maybe John perceived what he meant, even though nobody else, it says no one at the table knew why Jesus said what he said to Judas. But for sure, the two people that did know were Jesus and Judas. And so even when Jesus told him, "What you're going to do, go on, do it."
But Jesus, in a little bit, is going to tell Peter what he's going to do, and then he does it too.
Yeah. Yep. Except Judas didn't say, "No, not going to do it."
Oh, right.
Of course, he's not going to say that, because then he's sort of spilled the beans or whatever, and now everybody's going to be looking at him like, what are you doing? What are you planning on doing? But they didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. They just thought, oh, he's got to go buy something because he's in charge of the money. But even though Jesus said that to him, Judas still didn't turn from his course. Nobody was controlling him. God didn't have a little RC remote control car, up there in heaven like, all right, Judas, here, I got you now. And the devil didn't either. Operating against Judas's will, controlling him like a remote control car, Judas did exactly what Judas intended to do. It was all him, his plan. Yes?
Throughout all our lives, good seeds are planted and bad seeds are planted. And it's how you cultivate it and what you do with it.
Yep. Look at how many good seeds had to have been planted for Judas. How could it not? He was with Jesus for 3 years, at least. But
He still has a weakness.
there was something in there that he didn't get out. And that in itself is a lesson for us, that it doesn't matter necessarily how much good we pump into ourselves. If there's bad in there, we got to get that out, because it will come back to haunt us. If there's covetousness or lust or whatever it might be, we got to purge that out. The same principle of purging out the leaven, because a little bit of leaven will leaven the whole lump, applies in our own hearts and minds as well. Yeah, Dean?
It kind of seems hard for us to believe what the thing was. That was, you might say, Jesus' destiny. Someone had to betray Jesus. And it was going to be one of the 12. It didn't make any difference who it was, but one of them was going to betray him. And like I said, why Jesus would have picked somebody for that purpose, but he knew that, and God had told him. So I mean, it wasn't a surprise. So, but the thing is, it's hard for us to understand, why Judas, why he had to do that. But so that was his mission here on this earth. He was portrayed.
But he still could have repented. That's the
Yes.
most heartbreaking part of it, is that he
Yeah,
could have been forgiven.
he could have.
Too far gone.
He could have turned, he also could have not betrayed Jesus.
Right.
I have no doubt. As far as a personal choice is concerned, the one thing that was going to happen was that Jesus was going to be taken and killed. Now remember what Mordecai told Esther? He said, God is going to save our people somehow. But you could make him save our people through you. But if you don't do it, if you don't do something, he's still going to accomplish it. Well, the death of Jesus, which was for the salvation of the world, was going to be accomplished. Now Judas, this is what's so confusing to us, or not confusing, but difficult for us to understand about prophecy. It's kind of like time travel in movies and shows. If you've ever watched anything that has time travel in it, sometimes it's called mind-bending. The genre will include something like, you know why time travel is mind-bending? Because it's not natural. And there are so many things it does bend your mind, like, well, this person, if they hadn't gone back in time and done that, then this thing would have never happened. And, it's like so crazy to think about. Prophecy is kind of like that in a way, because it's not that Jesus chose Judas specifically because he knew he was going to betray him, but God had already seen it happen.
Like the movie he saw before.
Yeah, God already saw it all happen. Jesus chose Judas because Judas was supposed to be chosen. But he knew he was going to betray him because he'd already seen it happen. So it's impossible for us to wrap our minds around it, because we can't jump around in time and, see something happen and then go back and then make a choice because I got to choose this man because I saw him do this thing. But God is outside of time. So whenever there's prophecy about Judas, of course the prophecy is not about Judas. It's about the one that would betray Jesus, who ended up being Judas. It's not that he had to be chosen because he had to make that choice, but God already knew that he was going to make the choice. I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and that kind of goes to show my point that it's hard for us to understand prophecy, but it's not that God was making things happen to fulfill prophecy, but those things were going to happen anyway, and that's why he was able to prophesy it, because he'd already seen it. Yeah, Jam?
With that, what you were saying, we don't understand this stuff because God made us not to know. If we knew what was going to happen in the Bible at a time like that, like God did, we wouldn't be the way we are.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be the way we are.
Yeah, that's true.
And, Judas betraying Jesus like he did, it had to happen. It was already set in stone to happen because God made it happen. God knew what was going to happen, and
Yeah.
he allowed it.
Yeah, God knew what was going to happen. Jesus knew. I'm convinced Jesus knew. Even when he chose the apostles, he probably already knew at that point exactly what was going to happen, or at least that he was going to be betrayed. The only way that it had to happen is because the Jews, their main obstacle was getting Jesus away from a crowd. Every time they tried to get him, that was what stopped them, because they knew what the people thought about Jesus. So we can't take him in front of these people. We've got to find a way to get Jesus when he's not surrounded by a crowd of people. And guess what? That was hardly ever. Because everywhere, even Jesus, when Jesus didn't want to be around a crowd, he was still around a crowd. I'm going to go and depart into this desolate place. Well, before you know it, it's not desolate anymore, because Jesus is there. So everybody, as soon as one person knows that Jesus is there, that wasn't in his circle anyway, everybody knows. It spreads that fast. So Judas's part, what he offered them, I guess we're getting into the next section here in Matthew 26. What Judas offered was, I know how you can get Jesus in the absence of a crowd. That was all they needed him to do. They didn't need Judas to tell them who Jesus was. The kiss wasn't necessarily, the main thing that he did to betray Jesus. That was just what he came up with to be the mark or whatever. But the men that were going to get him probably already had seen him before. But either way, Judas offered them the way that they could get Jesus. Seize him, arrest him, without having to worry about a crowd, because he knew where he always went. You see, we just read in John 13, Judas left. They were all sitting at the table. Judas left. So whatever happened from that point forward in that room, Judas wasn't present, including, we see there's a very extended conversation there in John 13, John 14, I think all the way to 16. Judas isn't there for any of that. So all this about the promise of the Holy Spirit coming to the apostles, everything else he said, the high priestly prayer, Judas wasn't there for any of that. But then they leave to go to the garden. Well, how did Judas know that they were going to the garden? Well, because he knew. Either Jesus had already said they're going to do that, or he just knew that this was what the pattern of what he was going to do. So what Judas offered them in Matthew 26, it says in verse 14, Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, What will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. That's a fulfillment of Zechariah 11, verse 12. And verse 16 says, And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. You see, there's intent there. It was a deliberate thing. The same kind of language that we see from that moment, they started looking for an opportunity to seize Jesus, to kill him. Judas, from this moment, sought an opportunity to betray Jesus, to betray him by allowing his enemies the opportunity that they needed, which was strictly the absence of a crowd. Judas says, I know exactly how to do that. 30 pieces of silver is all it took. There have been other things specified about the significance of 30 pieces of silver. I'm not sure if there's any significance to that being the price paid to a master for a slave who was injured. But we do know Zechariah 11 verses 12 and 13 is certainly significant in this connection. So, yeah.
Which is what God was saying to Israel in Zechariah.
And again,
That's all I wanted to hear.
yeah, that may be evidence that Judas, further evidence, I would say, that Judas didn't really expect it to work, which would also explain his sudden dismay when it seemed like it did. This may have been nothing more than a little business venture for a quick buck. They can't really take Jesus. Doesn't matter if I take them to him or not. Judas knew who Jesus was and what he could do. And he had seen him defeat them and evade them how many times now? But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. He consented to the terms, to the price. John 13:30 says, or 18:2 rather, says that Judas knew the place also, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So he knew exactly. And so the traitor led a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. That's John 18:3. And this is when Judas said, or came up to him, greeted him, and kissed him, because that's what he told him. That apparently was going to be the signal, the cue for them. That's when they take him. That's when they get him. So Judas has now done. He's done it. He went through with it. He went to them. He brought them there, and now he's had the nerve to even approach Jesus directly and greet him and kiss him in an act of betrayal, all of which, verse 4 of John 18 says Jesus knew everything that was going to happen to him in this connection. But he also neutralized Judas's whole place in this, because he said, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "Oh, that's me." Judas didn't really have that much of a role to play at all, except for telling them he's going to be at the garden in Gethsemane. Well, after all that, the rest that had unfolded, that, with Jesus' mock trial, or at least leading up to that, Matthew 27, the beginning of Matthew 27, verses 3 and following says, when Judas... Well, let's just read the first two verses also. It says, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate the governor. Then, when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, What's that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, said, it's not lawful to put them into the treasury since it's blood money. It's the most disgusting, hypocritical corruption you could ever imagine. It's blood money. The money that they paid Judas to turn Jesus in, to lead them to Jesus, which is what turned it into blood money. You can see Jesus characterized them as straining the gnat and swallowing the camel, being real specific and careful about certain matters of the law, but then totally ignoring others. Here, they were perfectly okay with taking an innocent man into custody, rigging the trial, and hiring false witnesses specifically to get him condemned and to get the people behind their effort. But they weren't willing to put that money into the treasury because it's blood money. Perfect example of what Jesus accused them of. Total hypocrisy, total corruption, totally self-blinded. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. So again, it is not possible for us to know what Judas thought would happen after Jesus was surrounded in the garden. We don't know what was in his mind. He may have thought Jesus would disappear right in front of him. He may have thought that Jesus would strike them all dead. He may have, probably not, because Jesus never did anything like that, but he may have thought Jesus would just get out again. We don't know what he thought. What we do know is that he was apparently the thing that brought him to his senses, according to the text, according to Matthew, was when he saw that Jesus was condemned. That is when it all hit him. And he realized, oh no, what have I can't believe what I've done. I've really messed up. That is what Matthew explicitly tells us. He changed his mind when he saw, not when he saw that Jesus was taken by them, not when he was led out of the garden, not when Jesus appeared to be letting this happen. It was when he saw that Jesus was condemned to death and then being escorted over to Pilate that Judas changed his mind. That, to me, seems to indicate that Judas did not expect that to happen. I don't know what else to do with that other than conclude Judas didn't expect that to happen. I don't know what he did expect to happen, but he didn't expect that to happen because as soon as he saw that, he changed his mind. But the sad thing is, the saddest part of all this is that when he changed his mind, he didn't apparently change his heart. Or at least, even sadder still, is the idea that he didn't think that he was worthy of being forgiven.
He let his shame, like, it can go one of two ways.
Yeah. You know, what's ironic, maybe not ironic, but certainly significant, right before this chapter, the end of chapter 26, is when Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And the last thing we read in chapter 26 is, Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, and he went out and wept bitterly. So Peter in Matthew 26:75 is in the exact same position, emotionally and spiritually for that matter, as Judas is in Matthew 27:3. But from that point on, they went about it in a totally different way. In fact, at first, Judas did a little bit more, it seems, than Peter even did, by at least going to them and trying to take it back. Here's the money. We don't want the money. He throws it down. Well, I don't want it for sure, and I won't have it. He says, I've sinned by betraying innocent blood. Another of many, many, many instances of a person in sin going to another person and confessing their sin. You'd be surprised how many times that happens, which is in perfect harmony with what we as Christians are instructed to do as well in the church. He confesses his sin not just to God but to others and tries to take it back. But the tragedy is whenever they refused him. He didn't see that there was anything that he could do. And so he killed himself. That's when a person, at least a person who is not, unfortunately or even accidentally under the influence of some substance, when somebody takes their own life is when they don't see any other thing. I'm at a brick wall in every direction. There's nothing I can do.
Couldn't live with it. His mind wouldn't accept, he could not live with the fact of what he'd done.
Yeah.
So he just ended it.
And that's the tragedy. Because it was good that he couldn't live with it. But what the tragedy is that he did not consider or fully appreciate just how much God loves him. Even he could be forgiven. But he apparently did not think that. Yeah.
Well, and it just goes to show you like the two different ways that went. Peter, as you pointed that out, he decided to throw himself on the mercy of, beg for forgiveness,
Mhm.
and take the power of the gospel and everything he learned to redeem himself. Not what he did, but the power that did that.
Yeah.
And he took it upon himself this whole time. You can see his journey of, he was the one, me, I did this, I did that. It was all him. And instead of saying, I can get myself out of this situation, I can't do it, I don't know what to do, he totally forgot all that he had learned
Yeah.
being with Jesus, saying, it's not me, I don't need to do this, it's not me, it's the power that, the gospel, and it's, that brick wall you're talking about is fine until you know how that could end.
Yeah. There is a way. He couldn't see it, but there was. He could have thrown himself at Jesus' feet and said the same thing that he said to them. But I lay some of the blame on the chief priests and the elders as well, because they certainly didn't help Judas to come to any other conclusion or mindset. And that, to me, is a lesson for us when there is a brother or sister or a non-Christian, for that matter, who comes to the conclusion that they have sinned and they need a remedy. We need to be extra careful and extra helpful to them to help them to see that there is something they can do to fix it.
But from their viewpoint, he did the right thing.
Well, yeah, they didn't want to help him. He had done what they wanted him to do, and they didn't care about him anymore.
He was an enemy, a human, claiming to be God, and so they never caught on. And I don't think Judas ever caught on the fact that there was something beyond this world. And that's why he ended it the way he did.
Yeah.
Because if money, which John said was his motivator from early on, was the motivator, then money, mammon, this world was his God.
Yeah.
And Jesus was never able to. The other thing I was thinking is that I don't know that we're told why Jesus chose any of his apostles. And sometimes I think we think he chose people with just a clean slate. But yet we see that he actually chose men with baggage from the Lord. And each of those men had to deal with that as they were learning from him.
Yep.
And most caught on. Unfortunately, Judas didn't.
Yeah, none of them were perfect. Peter had baggage, different than Judas's baggage. One of the apostles was a zealot, and the zealots were the party of the Jews that was very much political, and we're going to take down Rome. And yet, he seemed to overcome his baggage. Wayne, do you have something?
Well, Judas didn't really know Christ, even though he was chosen, even though he was with him, because he would have done what Paul did. Paul knew Christ, Paul knew God could forgive him of all the treacherous things he'd done to Christians because of the power that he had by submitting to it. Judas never did that. His heart was never right all along the way. We need to look at ourselves. Do we really trust and know the Christ and the power that he has?
Yeah, there's a difference between changing your mind and truly repenting and turning to God. That's a very powerful lesson in the end of Judas. Yeah, Jam, I'll give you the last word.
See, that's where I want to learn more about this stuff because his betrayal had a lot to do with what happened to Jesus. And we now know we, as Christians, should be thinking, oh, look what has happened to Judas and what can happen to us.
Mm-hmm.
And in this world, today in the world that we live in, it's hard to fathom the idea that people will betray Jesus for what they want.
Yeah,
And it's like,
people will do it. Yeah.
when we talk about salvation stuff, it's like, we have to be careful what we do. Because we can help someone, but there's a point to where we have to be careful how to help.
Yeah. The main thing we got to do is make sure that we learn from Judas's mistake and not fall into the same trap. Even when we feel hopeless, it's good to feel regret for a sin, but we got to take that extra step and turn to God, because only God can forgive us of our sins. Sometimes other people are a part of that too. I need to seek other people's forgiveness if it applies to that sin. But ultimately, I've got to turn to God, and like Paul did, like Wayne mentioned. So seek his forgiveness. The tragedy of Judas is that he didn't do that. He could have been forgiven, but he didn't repent